In the first 4 years of my marriage, I didn't think of Meryl as my husband. I thought of him as that man, an egocentric bully who I'd been forced to marry, a man in control of my life, my body. I was nothing to that man than a piece of meat to bear his perfect children. Sex was the only currency that I had to spend in my marriage. Every good polygamist wife knows this. The home base of the FLDS Church is situated in between the two twin cities of Hillsdale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona, and is currently home to more than 10,000 individuals. According to a New York Times article in 2013, leader of said church, Warren Jeffs, was sentenced to a lifetime in prison on the sexual assault of 2 teenage girls, one of whom who was only 12 years old. Well, for most of us, religion holds a special place in our hearts. Sometimes the need for safety far outweighs that special place, even if it means saying goodbye to a world that you have always known. Escape. A True Story of Life Inside the FLDS by Carolyn Jessop. I was born into 6 generations of polygamy on my mother's side and started life in a fundamentalist Mormon church known as the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Polygamy was our main issue and the reason that we'd separated from the mainstream Mormon church. We believed that polygamy was the most sacred aspect of our faith and that we were the Church of God. I felt like the luckiest girl to be born into it. Even having the opportunity to be born into a plural marriage was offered to me as a sacred blessing, proof that I'd been born into a faithful bloodline. And, since elected to come to such a bloodline, my grandmother told me that I had the chance to become a goddess if I proved worthy. It was our own version of a Cinderella story. I was 18 when one night my father summoned me. I couldn't tell you why he or my mother would have wanted me at such a late hour. He sat me down and told me he had a chance to speak to my Uncle Roy, a prophet, who told me that I should be married. And he wanted me to marry Meryl Jessop. I knew the name. I'd gone to school with some of his daughters. And I was now going to become one of their mothers. My father went on to explain that when a directive comes down from a prophet such as this, it's important not to waste time. The wedding was set for Saturday, only 2 days away. This was outrageous. My life was being taken out from under me. Marrying a man who was like 50 was like marrying my grandfather. But at that age, I was still raised in the sect and believed that my Uncle Roy was a prophet of God. To deny his wishes was to deny God's will. So, on the Saturday after I graduated high school, I became Meryl's 4th wife. I was bound to love, bear his children, and serve him without question until the day I died. Meryl's abuse was well known among his wives. He used to slap my first child, Arthur, and hold him under running water until he started to scream. And I did nothing. You see, Meryl's wives were nothing but slaves forced to do his bidding. While he lived lavishly on fine wine and cuisine, we were lucky enough to get a decent tomato sandwich. And prayer time was when Meryl terrorized the entire family. He would go one by one to each child until he or she burst into tears. And when he was done with his children, he turned on his wives, yelling at us about our sloppy housekeeping, how poor we were at preparing supper, our disobedience in his name. And we took our reprimands without a single word in defense. It wasn't until one spring, when my 7th child, Harrison, started to have seizures, that I finally stood up to Meryl and understood the full force of his abuse. You see, Harrison was crying from this unbearable pain, and I wanted to take him to a doctor, but Meryl showed zero concern. It was obvious he thought that our son was my problem. Meryl turned on me with a vengeance, berating me, but at that point, I didn't care what Meryl thought or said. No, I looked at him exactly the way that I thought of him. As an arrogant, sadistic asshole, he grabbed my arm and threw me against the alfalfa field. I stumbled over clumps of rock and dirt, but I would not let myself fall. No, I would not give him that pleasure. I spat in his face as he threw me again, but I stood my ground. I looked at him with disgust and defiance as his face went red with anger. He told me that Harrison, one of my perfect children, was going to die because of my rebellion. That it was my fault that my son was sick. Harrison was going to die because of the sins of his mother. And that's when I knew we had to escape. I knew that if Meryl attacked me again, then this next time it would be much, much worse. And my children would suffer too. On a Monday morning, my escape had finally come. I'd been watching and waiting for days. I knew that the time was right. Only two things had to happen in order for us to leave, and they just did. Meryl was out of the house, and my children were at home. We had to act quickly. The choice was freedom or fear. And I was afraid to leave polygamy, the only life that I'd ever known. The other wives were starting to get suspicious. If one of them suspected a thing, they would immediately call Meryl. At 4 a.m., I started waking everybody up. I was very matter of fact when I woke each of my children. I said that Harrison was sick and we had to get him to a doctor. I unloaded everybody in the car and we started to drive. The night was deathly dark. I checked in the rearview mirror for any approaching headlights, and as soon as I saw them, I pressed the ignition. My children knew that something was wrong and they were starting to get angry. My daughter started screaming at me, yelling about how I was kidnapping her and how I was going to be condemned by hell and how Meryl was going to find me, and I was afraid of damnation, but I was more afraid to be free of Meryl. And after 5 hours of pure hell, we arrived in Salt Lake City. I had 8 children and $25 to my name, but for the first time in 35 years, I was free. As my children and I started to feel more safe and secure, I began to learn more stories of my husband's abuse. One of my daughters told me about the time that she was molested by one of her half-brothers. And one of my youngest, Patrick, told me about the time that his father beat him so hard he didn't know if he was going to live or not. It was awful for me to listen to. But I knew that their mental health depended on my ability to hear and to validate what they'd endured. Every morning for the past 5 years, my children and I have awakened with the promises of freedom and hope. I know now what it means to be safe. And I have learned that freedom is an extraordinary thing.